So, starting with the basis of free trade. So, trade is essentially the movement of goods and services across national borders. And then free trade is when there are no artificial protective barriers. So, that being tariffs, quotas, and subsidies, the big three you need to know about in Year 12 economics. So, there's no artificial protective barriers put in place by governments so that there is free movement of goods and services across national borders. So a country has an absolute advantage in production of a product, if there has more output with a given level of resources than in another country. So essentially there's higher productivity. So comparative advantage is the basis or the rationale behind trade, essentially looking at opportunity cost. You want economies to only produce the goods that they're efficient at, and so in order to get other goods that they're not efficient at producing, then they must be able to trade between economies. So looking at something you would have done in Year 11 is opportunity cost, so which is essentially what we've been talking about. So a country has comparative advantage in production if it is comparatively more efficient in production measured by a lower opportunity cost. So the country with the lowest opportunity cost is said to have the comparative advantage. So there's two ways we can sort of think about opportunity cost. Number one, opportunity cost can be the total revenue minus economic profit. Or opportunity cost, more commonly sort of what one has to sacrifice over what they have to gain. And so the less you have to sacrifice, the lower your opportunity cost is going to be, and thus the greater your comparative advantage is going to be. So when we're thinking about free trade, we want to think about advantages and disadvantages of why might an economy want to participate in free trade. Now, it may seem fairly self-explanatory of like why an economy would want to, but we'll talk about the advantages anyway. So the first being that economies can obtain goods that they otherwise wouldn't be able to produce, or that they're otherwise unattainable because one economy cannot produce every single good and service they need themselves in sufficient quantities to satisfy domestic demand, generally due to a lack of resources. You can't produce every single thing because you just don't have enough labour, don't have enough machinery, things like that. Second big advantage is it enables the efficient allocation of resources. So generally, countries only produce the goods in which they have the comparative advantage, because otherwise resources aren't being used efficiently, or they're going towards inefficient industries. So for example, if you ever want a good example to talk about in an essay or a short answer question, talk about car industry in Australia. So much protection on it, and it was so inefficient, and Australia was spending so much money producing cars that we just would have gotten so much cheaper if we just gotten them overseas. So yeah, that's an example of how resources can be going to inefficient industries. Therefore, labour was reallocated to more efficient industries such as tourism and services when protection was removed from the car industry in Australia, leading to a more efficient allocation of resources. So Australia was essentially like getting more bang for your buck, essentially. You've also got increased economies of scale. So essentially, economies of scale is something you would have looked at, I think at the very beginning of Year 11 you do it. And essentially, it means that there's going to be a lower average costs of production and increased efficiency and productivity if economies are only producing things that they're good at producing. So this includes things like getting more manufacturing goods. So an economy is really efficient at producing something, so they've got a lot of money, and then they buy some machinery that then can produce that good even more efficiently. Because the good can be produced more efficiently, it costs less to produce every single good, leading to the economy of scale. Free trade also leads to innovation because it encourages new technology and production throughout the world, and it increases living standards because things have lower prices because there's no protection attached to things, so there's no tariff that must be transported onto the consumer in order to afford it from the business. It increases production of goods and services, which means that there's more choice as well, and less people have to miss out. It means that countries have access to goods that lack natural resources that may prevent their production. So for example, countries like Australia can produce a lot of say coal and oil, but other economies that lack the access to those natural resources because geographically they just don't exist in that area now have access to those resources. And opening up of global markets also means higher rates of economic growth and increased real incomes as well. Now, the converse to that, why wouldn't you do free trade? Because it seems pretty self-explanatory. It seems, why wouldn't economies want to do that? Well, there are a fair few arguments against free trade. I'm just going to have a quick drink. So, the first disadvantage of free trade is looking at the short term. Or the majority of disadvantages to free trade actually look at the short term. But first of all, there's an increase in short-term unemployment when protection is removed from an industry. So for example, the government is going to increase a quota, they're going to decrease a tariff or decrease a subsidy, which means that they are taking away protection. Quick note with that, a lot of people get this confused. An increase in a quota is equal to a decrease in protection because increase in a quota means overseas producers can bring more into Australia. Something important, people get confused a lot. Make sure you remember that. Anyway, so domestic businesses may find it harder to compete with imports if they're not as protected. This is because they're just not as efficient as importing businesses, which means that people are going to buy imports because they're cheaper, because the more efficient something is, generally the cheaper it is. However, long term, this should correct itself because as things become inefficient and as unemployment rises due to a business collapsing, that employment should then be reallocated towards areas with a comparative advantage. So long term, this should correct itself. Keyword there being should. A lot of people say, who's to say that it's actually going to, but it is one reason to consider a disadvantage of free trade. Second being the infant industries argument. So it's difficult for new industries to establish themselves in a global market. So without protection or protectionist policies, industries or particular businesses don't have enough means or resources to establish themselves with a significant market share in the global economy. So this is because larger foreign companies are able to produce things at a lower price because they've already established themselves. So without protection, industries cannot establish themselves because they just cannot produce things at such a low price. Again, a lot of people say that this should either correct itself and that as industries start small, get bigger, or B, we should just be allocating resources to where we can produce goods at a lower price anyway. The third reason is dumping. Now, dumping is typically the only disadvantage of free trade that economists generally agree on. It is probably the one problem with free trade that cannot organically be fixed. So essentially that in the long term essentially won't correct itself. So essentially what dumping is the production surpluses from other countries are sold at unrealistically low prices in a different country. And it does hurt efficient domestic industries. Now, essentially, I'll give you an example, is, for example, if, let's say China was producing like red t-shirts at a really, really high rate. They were very, very efficient at it. And they expected that a lot of people in China wanted to buy red t-shirts. Now, let's say people in China actually decided, no, we want to buy, we want to buy pink t-shirts instead. So what happens then is China has become really efficient at buying the at creating the red t-shirts, but they have a lot to spare. So what they do is they take those red t-shirts and they say, no, we're actually going to import these into Australia, but they really want to get rid of those red t-shirts. They don't want them anymore because they want to start producing the pink t-shirts. So what they'll do is they will sell those red t-shirts in Australia at a really, really low price so that they're really attractive to Australian consumers. And therefore, Australian consumers choose to buy those red t-shirts that have been imported from China rather than the red t-shirts that have been made from Australian producers. So it does hurt domestic industries and it cannot organically correct itself. And it happens with all sorts of goods, things like, let's say, America producing like pink drink bottles at a really high rate. And, you know, even if people in America still want the pink drink bottles, the producers in America might say to themselves, actually, you know what, let's just import some of these into Australia. We'll sell them at a really low price anyway. And so now all of a sudden people in Australia are buying their pink drink bottles from an American company because they're so much cheaper than buying the pink drink bottle in Australia. So yeah, that dumping is the one disadvantage of free trade that is generally agreed upon by economists. And then you've also got free trade can encourage environmentally irresponsible production methods, because producers may participate in environmentally damaging practices if it means that they can produce their products at a lower cost, because lower cost means high profit. And without protection or without government intervention, this leads to negative externalities such as high pollution, degradation of the environment, decreased water quality, decreased air quality, things like that. So that's pretty much the big things that you need to know about free trade. The next